afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Laguna Woods Democratic Club's program for the month of April. Today we have the good fortune of having with us David Meyer, and I will be introducing him in a moment to tell you what he will be speaking on. I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in. I'd like to thank Lindsay Lefebvre of the DPOC for recording this for us. I'd like to thank Jean Lepowski, who will do our moment of reflection, and Rebecca Gilad, who will be asking the questions, okay? Right now we have Jean Lepowski, who is our field organizer, who will be doing a moment of reflection for us. And this is something that we're going to be doing at every one of our meetings this year. Most of these moment of reflections will have to do with the Black Lives Matter movement, and for all of us to think just for a moment about racism in the United States. Thank you, Jean.
Okay, I'm going to talk about institutionalized racism, which is something that especially we white people have a little bit of difficulty understanding, because it's not something that we've had to deal with in our personal lives, whereas other people with different color skin have had to deal with it directly. The most obvious example of institutionalized racism is Washington, D.C. It was founded in 1790, and at that time the city there wasn't any. It was run by its citizens, but there wasn't any option to participate in national politics. And of course, Black people couldn't vote at all because they were enslaved at that time. And that didn't change until 1867, after the Civil War, when Congress passed the District of Columbia Suffrage Act, suffrage bill, which granted Black men the right to vote for the first time in history. And there were quite a few Black people living in DC, as you can see from the image. There was an established university, Howard University, which was Kamala Harris' alma mater, and you can see that it had many students. Black people made up 1/3 of DC's population, but when it came to voting, Black men were 50% of registered voters, so they were overrepresented. And this was not what Congress expected, and apparently they didn't want that, because in 1871 and again in 1874, they passed laws that dismantled DC's government and gave the president, whom DC residents still couldn't vote for, the power to appoint leaders in DC. And that's how things stayed for almost 90 years, until 1961, which is when the 23rd Amendment was passed and DC residents were finally allowed to vote for president. The 23rd Amendment wasn't perfect. It did allow DC to have 3 electors, but the number of electors was not based on population as it is in the rest of in the states, but it was based on Alaska's number of electors, because at that time Alaska was the least populous state in the nation. In 1968, Congress gave DC residents the right to elect a Board of Education. In 1970, DC was allowed a delegate, a representative in the House of Representatives, but that delegate was not able to vote on legislation. All that delegate could do was participate in the discussion. And then in 2001, 20 years ago, locally elected officials finally regained the authority over aspects of local affairs that were granted in the Home Rule Charter, which was originally approved back in 1974. But even today, in 2021, Washington, D.C. does not have legislative, judicial, or budgetary autonomy. Now, this is a quote by a woman by the name of Mary Logan. She was married to a man who had been a politician, also a Union general, and he was part of the radical wing of the Republican Party, which at the time were the radical anti-slavery people in the Republican Party. She wrote a memoir in 1901 called 30 Years in Washington. And in this memoir, she says, "It is useless to deny the fact that white people of the District of Columbia do not wish a political franchise. They would much prefer that Congress should govern the district, even if it is not always with justice. They decline to subject themselves to the dangers of the vote of so large a colored element in municipal elections." The fact that Congress still does not trust the Black people of DC to fully participate in our democracy is an example of institutionalized racism.
Oops. Thank you, Jean. Now we're going to, that gave everyone plenty to think about. Now we are going to move on and hear our main speaker for the day, and that is David Meyer, who will be speaking on protest and the end of the Trump era. David is currently a professor of sociology and political science at UCI, but he previously taught at the City College of New York and at the University of Michigan, Tufts, and Harvard. His general areas of interest include social movements, political sociology, and public policy. In addition to teaching, he has written 6 books and countless articles. Thank you so much for being with us today, Professor Meyer. We are very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
I'm very happy to be here, and I thank you for the invitation. I write about protest movements, and because the time is limited here, I'm going to try to get to the conclusion right away, if I can get my PowerPoint to work. The conclusion: protest movements help bring down Donald Trump. Protest movements, when they're effective, move the center of politics if activists are able to maintain a contact with institutional politics. Biden has already been influenced by those movements. But Trump supporters are going to be protesting too. It's going to continue. Polarization makes normal politics difficult and obscures the details of policy, and we have work to do. So that's the conclusion I'm going to get to. Let's see how we get there. So I've been studying social movements forever, but I was an English major as an undergraduate, so I make cheap literary references constantly. The Trump administration represented the worst of times, American carnage, but for somebody like me who studies social movements, it was also the best of times, because there were tons of protest movements everywhere. Most notably starting with the Women's March the day after Trump was inaugurated. An estimated 3 to 4 million people across the United States. Massive, the biggest single day demonstration in American history, and Trump didn't resign. Well, is that a defeat, or is the world a little more complicated? First of all, if you think about the women's movement, it didn't come out of, the Women's March didn't come out of nowhere. There were protests against Trump while he was campaigning for president, mostly focused on race. There were, the Women's March grew out of campaigns like Black Lives Matter, which had started in 2013. And even before that, Occupy, which goes back to 2011. The Women's March was kind of a culmination and a beginning at the same time. What did they want? Women's rights, this is from the website that they were using years ago. Women's rights are human rights, end violence, reproductive rights, LGBTQIA rights, workers' rights, disability rights, immigrant rights, environmental justice. A comprehensive agenda, none of which happened immediately. But yet a week later, tens of thousands of people massed to American airports to protest against the Muslim ban, which was instituted that Friday afternoon. And if you looked around the crowds, you could see a lot of those pink pussy hats, because those people were initially mobilized and organized by the Women's March. Successful protest mobilization polarizes. It stiffens the spines of your allies, it weakens the resolve of opponents, and it encourages others to imitate. And basically, the Women's March unleashed a parade of protests where every week in Washington, D.C., there was another cause. This is just an odd selection. March for Science, Day Without a Women, immigrant rights, People's Climate March, on and on and on, March for Truth. This also had the additional effect, because Trump was not a very good politician, of trolling it. Protesters provoke answers. They encourage journalists to ask the question, well, what about whatever? What about the Civil Rights Act? What about the nuclear freeze? And by provoking answers, they provoke errors. For Trump, it provoked attacks on the judiciary, a constant and confused explanation of goals. He softened the revised ban twice, and it was finally judged constitutional by the Supreme Court 3 years later. Meanwhile, activists who engaged in national politics turned their focus locally, protests and town hall meetings. We saw this in Irvine. We saw this across Orange County and indeed across the United States. Emulating actually the Tea Party, Indivisible said we need a Tea Party of the left. And as a result of that mobilization, the drive to repeal the ACA, the American Health Care Act that Obama had passed in 2009, failed. They couldn't repeal it. They said it's overdetermined. There are lots of reasons it failed. It was a crappy bill. The leadership made errors. They were torn among themselves about conservative purity. And it was really, 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 really unpopular. 17% public support is low. 2018 election is a result of continued mobilization at the local level and at the national level. The Democrats make big gains, 40 seats. They flip seats, like our seat, California 45th. And on the left, you can see Katie Porter, who was reelected in 2020. And this is the ego thing that I just did, just bragging. On the right, you see my younger daughter, Jean Meyer, who about an hour and a half ago was elected to be president of University High School student body in Irvine, California. Hooray, I'm just touched. Okay. So they flipped seats. They also pushed the left within safe Democratic seats. You've seen her before. That's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who calls herself a socialist. We'll come to that again. The stronger institutional position of Democrats made it harder for Trump to do what he wanted and exposed his policies to greater scrutiny. The connection between the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives and activists in the streets made the movement on the left more powerful. Not powerful enough to get very much, but powerful enough to stop a lot. Okay? Now, midterm defeats in American politics are just nothing new at all. All those guys suffered big defeats in the House of Representatives 2 years in. And they did what presidents normally do, which frustrates their supporters. They reached out to the other side and tried to be conciliatory with mostly limited success. Trump didn't do that. Trump dug into his base, intensified politics, intensified polarization, intensified partisanship. And all of that meant the actual debates about the particulars of policy took a back seat to public discussions about Trump. Are you for him or against him? For him or against him? It was kind of the difficulty of electing a malignant narcissist to the presidency is he occupies your mind for 4 years. Ugh. After the 2018 gains, the Democrats started lining up to run for president. Tons of people ran for president. The focus was on replacing Trump. Who can beat Trump? Who can beat Trump? Biden himself shied away from putting out very much specific in the way of ideas. Okay? That's his style as a politician. But there were plenty of ideas in the primaries, and those ideas didn't disappear after the election. Joe Biden is foundationally a centrist, okay? The center of the Democratic Party, and he shifts with the party toward that center. Record turnout in 2020, okay? And then the attack on the Capitol. which we all saw. Now, what's new and what's not new? We lost at the polls. What we'll take to the streets is not new. After Trump took office, Disrupt J20 occupied Washington, D.C. There were over 200 arrests. Protests at Capitol buildings, not new. There were the Open Up protests and the Red for Ed protests. What is different, what is unique at this moment in American history is the man who is occupying the presidency urged the crowd to attack his enemies. No deference to law, no deference to the Constitution. Protest polarizes. Dramatic action makes people take sides. And this has led to a split in the GOP coalition. Desperate resignations and people picking sides. Kelly Loeffler said she was gonna vote not to certify the election results, but after the protest, she decided otherwise. Josh Hawley in the bottom left there said, well, this is my best shot. I'm sticking with the people in the streets. What's next? Institutional responses, prosecutions. Will they separate the institutional Republican Party from this like white nationalist base, or will the institutional party lean toward the white nationalists? That's an unknown at this point. Is there a movement beyond Trump? Will it be connected to the Republican Party? That's the question that's going to affect us in the coming years. I want to go through this quickly because there's a lot to do and a lot to talk about, and I want to hear your questions. But you'll see that there are passionate concerns within the Republican Party that are mostly not popular. The core GOP policies are unpopular. Restricted immigration, social conservatism, anti-gay, anti-abortion, unpopular. Limited government support for people, unpopular, or the planet. Low taxes for the wealthy, unpopular. But they have intense supporters. Now in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see Mitt Romney as a young man standing next to his father, George Romney. And Romney represents an effort to bring back an institutional Republican Party that his father represented. Given the unpopularity, do you talk about the policies or do you talk about Mr. Potato Head? Mr. Potato Head makes sense. Democrats see crisis as an opportunity. Biden is not scared of going big. Partly that's because he has a lot of experience, partly because he tacks to the center of the coalition. And I'm reminded of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was also not known as particularly ideologically progressive, but was very willing to experiment and take action within office. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said of Roosevelt, he's a second-rate intellect and a first-rate temperament. And I wonder if that doesn't describe Joe Biden as well. Now, I was asked to talk about capitalism and socialism because you've heard the Democrats called socialist over and over and over and over again. And some Democrats claim to be democratic socialists. What are they talking about? They're talking about private ownership of property. They're talking about government regulation, progressive taxation, a social safety net, public health as a public government concern, paying attention to the earth. Is that socialist? Bernie Sanders says, yeah, that's socialism. Is that capitalist? Elizabeth Warren says, yeah, that's capitalism. That's how capitalism works. And so I pulled out my classic texts on this. That's Karl Marx on the left and Adam Smith on the right. And boy, if you brought them up and showed them what's going on today, they would say, where are all the horses? I mean, no, they would say it doesn't really fit with either of their types. It's probably closer to Adam Smith than Karl Marx. Okay, the labels obscure the details of policy. It's called negative mobilization or negative partisanship. You go against the devils, you want to be on the side of the angels. Our job, movements are going to continue below the labels, focus on the details of policy. Our job as citizens is to move the center. And I believe that picture at the bottom is from your place when Katie Porter came to visit. So let me just say, good job. And thank you for your patience.
Well, Thank you so much, Professor Meyer. That certainly gave us a lot to think about. And I'm sure that we must have quite a few questions already in the chat. And Rebecca, if you would like to start with the questions, that would be great.
Sure, I'll start with a question that was sent before Professor Meyer spoke, and it is a long question. So here it is. How does polling relate to successful protest movements? Reputable issue polling before elections, exit polling, and monthly or weekly has been expanding for decades. Does the success of those protest movements that succeed, such as by Black Lives Matter to reform policing for gay marriage, anti-Vietnam War, civil and voting rights in the early 60s and late 50s, women's suffrage up to 1920, etc., create popular support or reflect popular support, or both?
That is such a great question, and I've been obsessed with it lately. And I dug up some polls from the March on Washington. And on the eve of the March on Washington in 1963, where Martin Luther King gave that famous "I Have a Dream" speech, he was supported by 28% of Americans. 28% of Americans thought the March on Washington would be a good idea. That is a minority. And so fixating exclusively on popularity leads you astray. Over time, successful movements move the polls. One of the things about polling, when you look at those survey answers, they give you a good sense of what political scientists call valence. That is the direction, one way or another, the public is leading, but a poor sense of salience. That is how important the issue is to people. And that old slogan about a committed minority can do a lot, well, that's true in protest movements. One of the things that's been interesting to me is over 2020, the slogan Black Lives Matter became popular. It was not popular, particularly with white people, in 2013 when it started. It takes a lot of work and a lot of time to move public opinion. So is there a summary answer? Summary answer is don't fetishize polls, but movements, when successful, can change public opinion.
Thank you. Our next question is, as a leading expert on social movement outcomes, over the next 4 years, do you anticipate that the nation will respond to the Black Lives Matter movement in particular? Will substantial progress be made in reducing the use of lethal force against unarmed Blacks by police?
Substantial is a big fudge word, unfortunately, right? So, I'm sure whatever happens is not going to be enough, but that doesn't mean that nothing will happen. Already in Los Angeles, they've moved school resource officers out of the schools. That's an immediate response. Already in Minneapolis right now, the officer who strangled George Floyd is facing trial for murder charges, which is extremely unusual when a police officer kills someone. So those are the effects of protest movements. Is that enough if you're a young Black or brown man in almost anywhere in the United States? No. It's court cases or cases, not causes. The process of reform and changing the way policing takes place is going to take a huge amount of work. And thus far, the campaigns have been low on specifics about how to change things. That's what Barack Obama took activists to task for, I think, in 2015. So I think we're in the middle of watching something happens, but how much of it happens in the next 4 years is very much an open question. And it depends a lot on what activists do.
Could you please compare the Tea Party movement and the Occupy movement?
That's about all I do. So thanks for that question. The Tea Party movement was really deeply tied to institutional politics. The Tea Party movement had the support of moneyed interests before it emerged and maintained that support. It built a congressional caucus after the first election it participated in. And when the grassroots disappeared, there were a couple of national organizations that continued their activism, and a newly energized congressional caucus that continued working on the same issues and expressing the same attitudes. Like I say, that Donald Trump is the Frankenstein monster that the Tea Party created. It's not what they wanted, it's not what they said they wanted, but it's something that was absolutely a response to them. In contrast, Occupy was determined to allow democratic self-governance in every level. And it made it very, very hard for the movement to institutionalize, to build alliances with mainstream politics, and to survive once the tactic that unified the occupiers disappeared, once the occupations were cleared out in November 2011. So a lot of people politicized and activated by Occupy spun out into the political system, working on all kinds of issues. So the people who were working on debt relief, the people who recruited Bernie Sanders and then Elizabeth Warren to run for president were occupiers. But the label and the unity had disappeared, so Occupy won't get credit for any of that. And it really has a great deal of difficulty, what's left of it, coordinating activity in the future. So I would say like two key differences. One, the money up front that the Tea Party had that Occupy didn't have. Two, the focus on maintaining a long-term presence, which the Tea Party had and Occupy didn't have. I hope that's a start anyway.
Another question. Do you believe the anti-Vietnam War protests helped to end the war?
Yes. And I think they had perverse outcomes too that are really strange. So one of the things that I did in graduate school, because graduate school is supposed to be a painful process, is I read Richard Nixon's memoirs. And if I recall correctly, this was discussed on pages RN, Memoirs of the President, which I think Nixon wrote himself because it's turgid prose. It's terrible. Pages 396 to 404, he talks about the protest movements in the streets and how they constrained what he could do in Vietnam. And he says, I wanted to threaten the use of nuclear weapons. I couldn't do that because of the division in the United States. That's an influence. Second, 1973, I think it's June 28th, the last American was drafted into the war. Imagine being the last American man drafted to fight in Vietnam. The end of the draft in 1973, while the war was still going on, is an effect of those protest movements. Didn't end the war, but it did end the draft, which took some of the pressure off the president. And there are perverse elements to that, because having an all volunteer force where everyone has signed on for whatever reason is a force that is easier to deploy abroad and easier to send into wars. So that's, I think the anti-Vietnam protests mattered.
What are some government programs that are socialistic in nature, but which are readily accepted by most people?
I think the label socialism is something that's used to obscure the details of policy. And it's a criticism, it's an epithet that used to basically kill ideas if they could make it stick. So I know you know, that Ronald Reagan's political career started by campaigning against Medicare and Medicaid in 1964 and saying that was socialism. And he was a good speaker as a young man. And he said, if we don't stop it now, you'll be able to tell your children about a time when America used to be free. Well, every time I look at it, Medicare and Medicaid are really crazy popular, Medicare particularly. My mom likes it, and I'm glad that she has Medicare, and I hope one day to have it myself. So it's massively popular, socialist in 1964. Progressive taxation, socialist. Okay. Child allowances, which is in the anti-COVID bill that Biden signed last week. Giving money for people with children to take care of their children and reduce the rate of childhood poverty. Republicans in Congress are calling that socialist, but it's a common program across the West in rich countries. So you want to call that socialist? It kind of depends if you like it or not. If you like it, then you tend not to call it socialist. If you want to stop looking at what the policy does, then you call it socialist.
Question: is Falun Gong considered a social movement?
I know less about Falun Gong than I should to answer the question in an informed way. As I understand it, a social movement is something that contests mainstream politics and draws from the mainstream, mobilizing people to undertake activity that is for them unusual. And from what I know about the Falun Gong, it is a social movement.
Okay. How about this one? Is the Trump era really over, or will he influence next election even if he doesn't run?
I wouldn't call an end yet. I think if you look at people like there's the bunch of young Republican senators who are all aspiring to be president are all like lining themselves up in relationship to Trump in some way. And that would be Sass, who is trying to carve out a distinct profile from Trump. Rubio, who is elusive and mushy, but doesn't want to desert Trump. Hawley, Cruz. Am I leaving somebody out? Maybe it's four. Hawley and Cruz, who are trying to embody the Trump constituency and sign away and pretend they didn't go to law school and learn anything there. So I don't think Trump is gone, and I don't think Trumpism is gone, and I don't think white nationalism is gone either. So I think there's plenty to deal with. One of the mistakes we make when we look at American history is we find markers like a presidential election or a big event, and we turn the page on a chapter. But the stories go on and on. So no, don't relax.
Okay, the next one is a comment. Let's see if you have a comment to the comment. The word socialism is used to discredit democratic policy ideas that the Republicans disagree with. What do you think?
Yes, the word socialism is used to discredit democratic ideas that you disagree with. Doesn't even have to be democratic ideas. It's like a curse word. And the thing that's strange, that's really different in the last, let's say, 6 years than in any time I've been alive, is young people don't care. Young people, like if you say to like a 25-year-old, well, that idea is socialist, whatever it is, child allowances, progressive taxation, Green New Deal, they say, okay, so? And I think Republicans are unprepared for that. But there is, and you know this, a huge age skew right now, where support for Democrats is much, much, much stronger among young people than any time in my life. And I think that's going to matter if people continue to vote and can continue to get to the polls.
Do you think there is a way to use power of protests and movements to eliminate the filibuster?
I think most members of the Senate are pragmatic politicians, and they respond to the people they think they're serving. They respond to the people they think will help keep them in office. So will protests matter about that? Sure. But do I think Joe Manchin is going to be paying attention to what people are doing in Laguna Beach? Not so much. I think he's worried about what's going on in West Virginia. So there's a question about diversifying the base of support for democratic reforms. And I think that could matter. I also think that there are probably some political science professors who care desperately about the fate of the filibuster. But I think most Americans care a lot more about results. And I think Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema are tuned into that. So I think the test is really, really, really on the horizon, as many state legislatures, as you know, are considering efforts to bills that will make it much harder for people to vote. Like as a partisan of small d democracy, when I see that this is the biggest turnout in an election since probably 1896 in the United States, that makes me happy. I think we should be ecstatic about efforts that increase the diversity and size of the electorate. And actually, like the lieutenant governor of Georgia, who's a Republican, just said he was not going to run against Warnock in 2 years because he thinks the Republican Party is screwed up and he needs to fix that first, because the Republican Party should be able to win with a bigger electorate rather than having to reduce the size of the electorate. And this is a long way from the filibuster, so I guess I'm filibustering. I apologize. I'll stop and listen to the next question.
Next question. One political party has declared war on democracy. Since democracy is voluntary, we all have to agree to accept results at the least. Can our form of government continue if the war continues?
That's a scary question. And it's an open question. I would like to say that democracy in America is robust and strong. And I don't feel that that's true at this moment. And I think the fact that, you'd contrast Gore, who lost the presidency narrowly and was really depressed for years afterwards, but said, well, the system is more important than my candidacy. And to see people like Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley say, no, my candidacy, certainly Trump, is more important than the system, is devastating. And American history is, they're heroic losers. The most important thing that John Adams did, and he was a pretty important guy. He drafted the Constitution of Massachusetts, which was the basis for the national Constitution. The most important thing he did after he lost to Thomas Jefferson, whom he hated, was he went home. Said, well, the people have spoken, screw them, but I'm going home. And that's an attitude we have to bring back. And it's not going to be easy.
Next question. Does the phrase corporate socialism have any real meaning, or is it just a way to counteract the knee-jerk reaction from conservatives?
Corporate socialism or crony capitalism means taking care of big corporations and assuming that it will all work to the good in some way. I think corporate socialism is a slang pejorative, but it's it works to make the point that activists on the left want to make. And I do think the point is government has a long history in America of aiding business. You want to call that socialism? You want to call that maintaining capitalism? You want to call that corrupt crony capitalism? Well, let's go case by case. But I do think that we have a real test that we're going to see play out over the next months as the COVID bill Biden signed works through American politics, because it is heavily concentrated to spend money at the bottom of the economic ladder. And whether that's good for the economy, whether that creates inflation, these are things we can watch and organize around. And Biden's placing his bets in this, and the Democrats in the Congress are placing their bets on it. And I think it's something to pay a lot of attention to.
The next question wants your opinion on, will Trump's children run, and what can be done to discredit them so they do not run?
I don't even know if you don't want them to run. Maybe you want them to run because they'll make life miserable for the Republican Party. Like, do you think Lara Trump in North Carolina will be a stronger candidate than somebody who's actually served in office? Is Ivanka Trump somebody who can win in Florida? I don't know the answer. I didn't think Trump could win. So, I mean, I could easily be wrong about this and discredit them. My own very naive and idealistic view is it's our job to try to tell the truth and to try to pay attention to science and fact and to try to educate people and hope, a matter of faith that matters over the long haul.
In addition to Medicare and Social Security, what are some other examples that you could give us of socialism?
Okay, here's my story. I went to college. I was born the year after Sputnik went up. And the year after Sputnik went up, the United States passed the National Defense Student Loan Act, which was designed to expand education and provide, to strengthen the national defense by educating young people and educating greater numbers of young people in the sciences. But, I wasn't a science major and I was able to get some of that money. Is that a socialist program, making higher education accessible to young people? You want to call that socialist? Fine. I think it's a good thing, and I think it's an important thing for us to be paying attention to, particularly in California, where the population who is entering the universities doesn't look like the population who started in the universities years and years ago. And to make sure that today's young people have the same opportunities that I had in the 1970s. You want to call that socialism? You can call it socialism. But I think it's what makes democracy work, is diversifying and educating the electorate and the population and providing opportunities to people. Enthusiastic. That's our litmus.
Given the response you gave us about the filibuster, does that mean that Norm Ornstein's reform proposals are viable?
I don't know what Norman Ornstein is proposing in particular right now. He's prolific generator of ideas, and I'm always running a couple cycles behind. So what do you mean?
It doesn't, maybe they'll put something further. That was the whole question. So let me give you the next question. Okay. The distribution is bimodal in terms of support with each generation in different sides of the curve. Why are more young Democratic political hopefuls not coming forward, and what will encourage them to do so given their commitment to social justice, healthcare, and fair wage issues?
I think there are tons of young people engaged in activism. I think it's like I thought it was going to be my generation that was going to make the difference, and I was completely wrong about that. But this I've been teaching for like so many years, and the students I see over the last 3 or 4 years are quite unlike any group before that. The number of committed people who are willing to do all kinds of different things to make America better is larger than I've ever seen before, I've ever seen in the classroom. There are always a couple of people, but now it's almost some large amounts of the people who drift through my social science classes. Katie Porter got elected in 2018, at least partly because voter turnout at UCI went up to 33% from 2%. Well, I mean, we could say 33% is pretty low for, like these educated young people, which is true, but it's a hell of a lot bigger than 2%.
I
So,
believe I believe that the person that asked this question is sending something to add. I think that she means to more young people to run for office. That the number of young representatives in the Democratic side is less than the Republican side, with taking into consideration average age.
oh, the Democrats in office are older, for sure. And it's really hard to run for office. And if you like consult Democratic consultants, the people who are going to help you run for office, the first thing they do is they ask to see your phone, and they say, how many people in your contact list can you get to give you money? Because elections are so expensive. And I think that is off-putting for lots of young people, but it doesn't take everybody. And there are lots of, I mean, I have like fantasies about my younger daughter right now because she just won an election and she's been bold, and it doesn't take everybody. Also, the right now, the House of Representatives, I think everybody's 80 in the leadership. Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and Clyburn, I think they're all 80. And I think highly of all of them, but you have to make room for another generation. And that's happening. It's happening more slowly than you'd like. It always happens more slowly than you'd like, but I think it's happening.
Now, how did the Republicans give us arguably the two worst presidents in history within the past 20 years?
Generosity, magic, I don't know. But I am thinking about the anti-intellectualism part of it. So like something that's bizarre is that like you could dislike Obama or dislike Clinton for sure, but those guys cared about fact and they had like wattage, I mean, they were smart guys. And even Republicans who have wattage almost have to like conceal it in order to mobilize their constituency. And so I want to be optimistic about the turn to science. I also want to be optimistic that, as people get vaccines and feel more secure, they're going to realize that science actually matters and public investment in science actually matters. Seeing the support for Fauci and Francis Collins, who try very hard not to be partisan, but do talk about science and fact. I think that like cuts well for us over the long haul. I hope so.
What do you think? Not what do you think? What scares you the most nowadays when you think about politics?
The profit that comes from telling lies. The fact that people are shameless in a way that I don't recall. I mean, the level of shamelessness is something that I really, really don't recall at any time in my life, where, newspaper corrects on a matter of fact and the politician doesn't apologize, just says, oh, well, if you believe that newspaper, that's the scariest thing. And, as a teacher, I care about like getting facts out and like paying attention to like what works and what doesn't and telling the truth and not letting ideology trump everything else. Pardon for using Trump as a verb.
Because we're coming to the end of the hour, is there anything else that you would like to add that we haven't asked you?
I am very grateful for the Democratic Club of, at Laguna Woods. I think like one of the really cool things about civic engagement and about citizenship is the people you meet. And it's developing social relationships and connections to people that keeps people engaged over the long haul. And young activists are learning that. And maybe you're a model.
Sue?
Yes. I think we probably have time for one more short question.
Okay. I have more than questions. I have opinions or about how about this? Maybe we can turn this into a question. Anti-intellectualism plays well in the South and rural areas. So what is your opinion when you compare by areas, and where is that taking us?
Living in Orange County, where we see a diversity of attitudes toward science and toward politics. I mean, this is our, it's Laguna Woods is not the only place in Orange County. Makes me loath to draw generalizations about the South. I think investment in education and investment in democratic processes of discussing things on the basis of fact is the best future that we have. And I think like making sure that young Americans develop the tools to, I guess, a built-in crap detector, to know when people are lying to them or people are making up stuff, is the best investment in future politics that we can make.
Well, Professor Meyer, I can't tell you how many notes I wrote, and I'm going to try to focus on the positive things that you said. I like the idea about protests that don't necessarily get what they are looking for, but they can stop other things. And that's, I feel like that's very important. And also about FDR not being particularly progressive and a second-rate intellect, but a first-rate temperament, and how that compares to Joe Biden, considering how the great esteem with which I hold President Roosevelt, I think that bodes well for the country. I'm also very heartened by what you think is the political engagement of our young people. Having taught in upstate New York in a rural area where there was definite anti-intellectualism, and I noticed that, from the moment I started teaching, which was in 1974, and that's a real problem in America. But we would really like to thank you for everything that you have told us today. There is just so much to think about. Mostly that we need to keep protesting, and we need to keep engaging with young people. There are lots of young people in Orange County who are engaged in politics, as you said, who are activists. There's been a Democratic group at UC Irvine, and we have worked with them. And this is a reminder that we need to reach out to them again, because we helped get them started several years ago by giving them $25 to buy pizza. So, but there is more for us to do, and more that we should do. And this is a very, very good reminder for all of us. I would like to thank Lindsay Lefebvre of the DPOC for recording this for us. I'd like to thank Jean for her very important thoughts in the moment of reflection. I'd like to thank Rebecca for asking the questions. I'd like to thank everybody who joined us today, and the absolutely wonderful questions which you asked of Professor Meyer, and how good he was at answering every single one. He knew the answers to all of them. So thank you, Professor Meyer. And with that, I think I will say goodbye and leave you 1 minute to say goodbye as well.
I don't need a whole minute. Just thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to people outside of the classroom. And I really value the work you've been doing. So thank you for having me. Take care.
Okay, and thank you. And I must say, as a former teacher, I can tell from your PowerPoint that you are an excellent teacher. Okay, and I'm sure that your students are all learning a lot. Thank you to everybody who joined us today on the Zoom, and thank you to everyone who is watching at home. We hope you will tell your friends about this program and that you will join us next month for our next program, which will be on immigration. Thank you so much to everybody. Bye.